Our only source is Josephus in his Wars and Antiquities works. In both accounts, they say that Herod lived 5 more days after he had Antipater, his son and heir, killed. So if anyone thinks that Matthew's massacre of the innocent in Bethlehem is not within Herod's sphere of evil, get real. Now Josephus said that Herod died 34 years after ordering Antigonus to be killed, and 37 years from him being declared king by Rome. And just a little bit before this, Josephus said that there was an eclipse of the moon. The special note here for us is that this is the only reference to an eclipse in all of Josephus's works. So, he was making it of importance because he tagged it with the event of Herod burning the brave men alive who ripped down the Roman eagle from the temple gate. Now, after Herod's grand funeral, Josephus mentions that the Passover was nearing as well. This helps us as Herod's death occurred sometime between Josephus's one and only ever mentioned eclipse and the annual spring Passover. This then begs the question of when did those two events occur in the middle? Because the natural next step would, and will be, is to find their dates, then add 34 and 37 on and see where we land. But before that is that we can generate a grid of eclipses from NASA's generator. You can see that I selected Jerusalem in the search. You can pick anywhere you like in the world, but this will give us what they would have been seeing at their given time of day. Astronomical dating uses year 0, whereas our calendar does not have 0 AD, so you have to subtract 1 to obtain your BC date. Now, here are all the eclipses from 10 BC to 5 AD, including if they were a partial or total eclipse. So, if you're going with a 4 BC date for Herod's death, is that then you are saying that March 13th's partial eclipse was the one that Josephus was referring to. Simplifying this down is that you can see the eclipses on the left and the converted dates of the 15th of Nisan, i.e. Passover, in the Gregorian dates on the right. So, if for some reason you selected 10 BC as Herod's death, you would then have to argue that the reference nearing Passover was the April 4th, 9 BC 1. For the sake of time, is that we can simply cross out the eclipses of 10 to 8 BC, as there's no way to argue for Herod's death being that early. And the corresponding 10 to 6 BC Passovers are no longer applicable as well, leaving us with the following. Now, we can do more process of elimination by noticing that 5 of these 8 occur after the Passover of their given year. And this would create a very large gap in time to the following year's spring festival. Why those are eliminated is because Josephus mentions that Archelaus brought in the troops to quell any uprising, because the people were still very mad about Herod executing Matthias and the others who tore down the eagle. And this transition period would be the best time for a revolution to commence, as the next king hadn't been officially declared by Emperor Augustus yet, because Herod just got done killing the heir, Antipater, and had to rewrite his wishes. So in haste, Archelaus sailed for Rome to claim the kingdom in front of Caesar because his brother Antipas was trying to claim the kingdom for himself. So the context does not allow for a long gap in time between Herod's death coming shortly after the eclipse to the following year's spring Passover. So we're down to only 3 possible combinations of eclipses and Passovers, with the given lapse in time between them. Now, you might have noticed that the last eclipse is only 4 days after December 25th. So, if you're going to stick with that exact birth date for Jesus, is that the first 2 eclipse options are out because Herod is already dead. The problem with this birth date is that you are now creating a rather untenable sequence of events between Matthew's and Luke's accounts, because Luke informs us that baby Jesus' presentation at the temple. This is datable because Luke says that Mary followed the purification period of 33 days after the circumcision of a male son from Leviticus 12. Yeah, that's a mouthful. So, you would be cramming all the events of the wise men's travels, Joseph and Mary booking it down to Egypt, the massacre in Bethlehem, then Herod dying, and finally Joseph and Mary return back from Egypt, where they would likely have to head straight to the temple for the mandated 40th day presentation. So, just be honest with yourself here. Does this really sound reasonable? No. And if you compare the shepherds showing up with the Magi's arrival, is that you have Jesus staying in two different spots. Now, I could also argue that Matthew's use of young child is in reference to a toddler, not a newborn. But the defender will say that Luke also used paideon, describing baby Jesus in his birth narrative. But what really undermines the sequencing of events is the return back from Egypt described in Matthew 2:22. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea, i.e. Jerusalem, in the room/house of his father Herod, Joseph was afraid to go there. Notwithstanding being warned of God in a dream, Joseph turned aside and took the family north into the parts of Galilee. Sorry to some of you out there, but those dates simply do not work within Scripture, nor in the sequence of Archelaus being declared king by Augustus after the spring Passover. And you just saw that God himself told Joseph, do not go into Jerusalem. So putting that one aside, let's now get into the dating of Herod's death. The 4 BC date was basically established in the late 19th century by Emil Schur. His, and others of that view, their main arguments are that Josephus said Herod was named king by the Roman Senate in the 184th Olympiad, when Calvinus was consul a second time, and Pollio was consul as well. The 184th Olympiad runs from July 1st, 44 BC to June 30th, 40 BC, as each Olympiad consists of 4 years, and also that you can see that Calvinus and Pollio were consuls in 40 BC. So, adding 37 years on and counting inclusively, meaning that you count 40 BC as a year, is that you land on 4 BC. Next is that Josephus said Herod conquered Jerusalem in the 185th Olympiad when Marcus Agrippa and Gallus were consuls. You can see that the span of the 184th Olympiad, with Agrippa and Gallus serving in 37 BC. So, adding 34 years on and counting inclusively again, is that you land on 4 BC. Next is that there is a 4 BC eclipse available for Herod's death to come shortly after. The added support to this would be to cite Rosh Hashanah's opening statement that the first of Nisan is the beginning of a new regnal year for kings in the spring. So, a Nisan to Nisan reckoning puts the 34th year in 4 BC. And the fourth would be to point out that Archelaus' rule lasted till his 10th year when Augustus banished him to Vienna. Josephus states that this occurred 37 years after the Battle of Actium, which was in 31 BC, so the 37th year falls on 6 AD when Cyrenius took over as governor of Syria, and reversing back 10 years is that it lands you on 4 BC again. So, because of these references, is that the 4 BC advocates place Jesus' birth sometime between 6 and 4 BC. Looks like a pretty good case, right? All the numbers seem to point to 4 BC at first glance. But the 4 BC date has challenges to it, because Josephus adds more chronological details to Herod being declared king and his conquering of Jerusalem. Starting with the conquering of Jerusalem with its supposed date of 37 BC, is that Josephus said more within the same statement by saying that this occurred exactly 27 years after Pompey's siege of Jerusalem, which occurred in the fall of 63 BC. So this moves the conquering from 37 to 36 BC. The fast, highlighted in pink, lets us know that this happened on the Day of Atonement, which is the 10th day of the 7th Jewish month. Josephus tethers another statement to this by saying that this ended the Hasmoneans' rule of 126 years. 1 Maccabees chapters 6 through 9 put the peace deal with the Romans in 162 BC, and adding 126 onto that gives you 36 BC as well. But Josephus included another significant detail about this year. He said that before this was a sabbatic year. Yes, these were still being practiced during the Second Temple period. Josephus explains how every 7th year that the Jews were letting the land rest, as the law required. 2 Chronicles explains that Israel's failure to keep it was part of the exiling punishment. And as such, the returnees learned this lesson and began keeping it again, as seen in Nehemiah, with the people agreeing to follow the Sabbath land rest rule. What adds to the 36th position is Wacholder's research on the topic, as he found 10 sources that can be dated with great accuracy and historically do fall on intervals of 7 years with significant events attached to them. And this makes a lot of practical sense because if you're going to attack a nation, you might as well do it when their food supply is really at its lowest. It shortens up the siege length considerably. But also on the flip side is that if you're trying to launch a revolt, then your people are also way more available to be organized and fight like Bar Kokhba tried to do in 132 AD. So, working off of the other 9 is that Herod's conquest must fall on the Tishri to Tishri overlap of 3736 BC, with Herod's 3-month siege taking place during the summer and ending on the Day of Atonement, which, according to Finnegan, is October 25th, 36 BC. 2nd century Roman historian Dio said that Rome did nothing significant in the Syrian territory following the consulship of Claudius and Norbanus. You can see that their consulship was in 38 BC. So, 37 BC is the year of nothing, with the following year, 36 BC, being the year that Herod conquered Jerusalem. So, Herod's first regnal year over Jerusalem didn't start until Nisan of 35 BC. That places his 34th year occurring from the spring of 2 BC to the spring of 1 BC, which the January 10th 1 BC eclipse falls within, but does not allow for the December 29th 1 BC eclipse, as it falls 9 months after this window, and likewise puts the March 13th 4 BC eclipse way before it. In regards to Herod being named king by the Roman Senate, is that Josephus tethers his naming to Titus's destruction of Jerusalem with a 107-year time frame. With the destruction occurring very firmly in 70 AD, and then reversing back, is that it places the Senate's naming in 38 BC. That connects with Josephus saying that the conquering was in the 3rd year of Herod being made king. And one more tethering statement that puts the 40 BC view to rest is that Josephus says that the Battle of Actium occurred in Herod's 7th year, which lands you on 38 BC for the start of his Roman regnal years, and thus puts his death in 1 BC. Another drive-by point is that when he was about to die, Josephus says that he was nearly 70 years old. Why this is a really precise number is that it takes us back to his first position as governor of Galilee. Josephus says that Antipater, Herod's dad, made himself procurator of Judea in the 9th year of Hyrcanus II being the high priest, after Pompey's siege of Jerusalem and being restored back in the high priest position. Adding 8 full years onto this is that it lands you on 55-54 BC. Then, after Caesar sailed back to Rome, is that Antipater made Herod governor of Galilee at just 15 years old, with the included statement that he was very young. Now, since Herod was 15 in 55 BC, is that this makes his 70th or his birth year in 7069 BC. Thus, adding on the nearly 70 years is that it puts you on 1 BC, not 4 BC. So Herod's death needs to be moved to 1 BC in all the history books, with the celestial events of 7, 6, and 5 BC being eliminated from contention, and recognize that the early church's tradition of 3-2 BC year was and still is the most accurate time frame for Jesus' birth. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some that say out there, I don't get to rewrite history. First, you clearly saw that I was simply letting Josephus speak for himself, along with corroborating sources. Next, if you're wondering about Archelaus's 4 BC to 6 AD timeframe, in that it somehow blocks Herod's death going past 4 BC, is that is simply not so, as they were described being co-regents with one another. Archelaus didn't have the same authority as Herod, but Josephus says that Archelaus had long been exercising royal authority before Herod died. You also see Antipater appealing to Herod to spare his life in front of Augustus, as he had already made him king. So, co-regency easily accounts for Archelaus' 4 BC start. And there are plenty of other places in Josephus that demonstrates this as well. The most likely counter to this is that upon Herod's death, Augustus carried out the splitting up of the kingdom amongst Herod's remaining sons. Philip the Tetrarch, who we saw listed in Luke 3:1, has his death and reign recorded by Josephus, saying that he died in the 20th year of Tiberius, and that he reigned as Tetrarch for 37 years. The 20th year being 34 AD, while using the Julian system, and reversing back from this takes you to 4 BC. So it seems like this limits Herod's death to 4 BC. However, David Byer took up the issue and dug through all the available manuscripts and copies in the British Museum and the Library of Congress to see what was actually recorded. Finnegan writes, David Byer reported to the Society of Biblical Literature his personal examination in the British Museum of 46 editions of Josephus's Antiquities published before 1700 AD, among which 27, all but 3 published before 1544, read the 22nd year of Tiberius, while not a single edition published prior to 1544 read the 20th year of Tiberius. Likewise, in the Library of Congress, 5 more editions read the 22nd year, while none prior to 1544 records the 20th year. It was also found that the oldest versions of the text give variant length of the reign for Philip of 32 and 36 years. But if we allow for a full 37-year reign, then the 22nd year of Tiberius, 35-36 AD, that this points to 1 BC as the year of the death of Herod. This is therefore the date which is accepted in this present book. Now, if you're wanting to dig into this a little bit more, is that Steinman and Young wrote recently on how Herod's sons also antedated their reigns intentionally to legitimize their authority over the territory. This was not an uncommon practice to have done. Which brings up the next point. I'm not making this stuff up. There are numerous scholars who have and are addressing this crucial period in Roman, Judean, and New Testament history. But I'm sure someone will say, well, what about Josephus's reference to the Olympiads and consulships? Simple. He was wrong. Steinman points out 3 reasons why. Starting with that Calvinus and Pollio were not appointed consuls until October 2nd of 40 BC. This places their consulship more properly in the first year of the 185th Olympiad, not the end of the 184th. Months matter when you get into the weeds of all this chronology stuff. Second is that Appian, in his works, places the context of all the Roman appointments later, which includes Herod's appointment. So he says it's more proper to be in 39 BC. And third is that Steinman points out that the defenders of Schur, Hermes and Miller, recognize that Herod didn't go to Rome until the winter months of 40 BC, thus putting his appointment in the 185th Olympiad, with the very earliest date being late 40 BC, but way more likely in 39 BC. All of this shows is that Josephus was off with his other reference to the 185th Olympiad and consulship reference. And this is why Finnegan converted from the 4 BC position to the 1 BC one after he read Filmer's and Martin's works on the matter. And what I just presented is only level 1 on showing that the 1 BC date is the correct one, and how the 4 BC position is completely untenable, especially when you try and squeeze all the events between the eclipse and the Passover into a 29-day period. It simply just doesn't work. And please, go and read Josephus's accounts for yourself on this. Which leads us to another point, on the eclipse itself. Remember that this is the only eclipse that Josephus ever mentions in his works, and he has a lot of eclipses at his disposal in just a 15-year span. And by looking at the chart, is that you can see that the March 13th 4 BC eclipse was the least in magnitude, while the January 10th 1 BC one was a total eclipse and was observable for a considerable length of time in Israel during the midnight hours. And not just that, this eclipse was a full-bored blood moon, and those carried significant weight in the ancient world as they were typically seen as omens. So, between these two possibilities, which one do you really think that Josephus was alluding to when he tagged Herod's killing of the priests in Antipater and then himself dying shortly thereafter of? Now, this leads us to a really big point. Luke was right. Correcting the date of Herod's death, and also seeing that Luke's 15th year of Tiberius reference is referring to 2728 AD, as he was using the Antioch and Syrian counting method of Tishri to Tishri years, because this fits his intended audience of Theophilus. You get 2728 AD with Augustus dying on August 19th, 14 AD, that places Tiberius's first year in the 1314 AD year span. Then, continuing this pattern, is that the 15th year lands you on 2728 AD timeframe. The back-end consideration is the Apostle Paul's chronology. The famed Gallio or Delphi inscription mentions that Gallio was proconsul when Claudius held tribunician rank for the 26th time. Dio's comment on this position shows that under Claudius that these were one-year positions, where with very few exceptions where some did hold it for 2 years in a row. He also mentions that new proconsuls need to set out from Rome by mid-April to go and relieve the current person in the position. So, a proconsul would likely have started in May or June. So, putting these 3 pieces together is that Claudius's 26th time as tribunician would be from January 25th, 52 AD to January 24th, 53 AD. Now, since Gallio was already proconsul, is that we reverse back with him by a year that places his start in May or June of 51 AD. Paul comes into play because in Acts 18:12 it says that he was tried before Gallio when he was proconsul. And this likely occurred at the beginning of Gallio's term, as it would have been the best time for the annoyed Jews to try and get Paul arrested, as a new proconsul wouldn't know who to trust that well upon arrival. Now, just before this, Luke mentions that Paul's time in Corinth was a year and a half, during which Claudius had expelled all the Jews from Rome. Suetonius wrote on this and said that Claudius expelled them on the account of Chrestus. Now, is this a reference to Jesus Christ? Well, let's just say the militant critics won't allow for that interpretation because it doesn't play in their mythic narrative. Regardless, Paul's year and a half in Corinth means that he arrived there in 49 AD, after the Jerusalem Council had met in Acts 15. The catch here is that Paul in his letter to the Galatians reflects on this and says that it had been 14 years since he went to Jerusalem for the first time. This provides us with a date for his composition of the letter to the Galatians in 49 AD. But Paul mentions more of his history in Galatians 1:16 through 18, saying that he was already in Arabia for 3 years after his conversion in Acts 9. And then he went to Jerusalem to try and meet with the apostles, but only met with Peter and James, the Lord's half-brother. Acts 9:26 speaks on this as well, with the added note that the others didn't want to see him because they were still afraid that he was likely just trying to trick them so that he could kill them all. But after they learned of his preaching of Jesus at Damascus, is that they sent him up to his hometown in Tarsus. This timeline is strengthened when we go back to Wacholder's list of sabbatical years, because you can see that 48-49 AD was a sabbatical year during which the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 met. What needs to be understood is that the sabbatical years left many Jews incredibly poor, which is why Paul asked the Galatians for financial support for the poor back in Jerusalem. You see him asking for the same type of request to the Corinthians and Romans at the end of his third missional journey in the 55-56 sabbatical year. What all of this does is that we can reverse back from 49 AD to his conversion in 32 AD, with the crucifixion most likely occurring in 30 AD. The early creedal statement and list of resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15 prohibits critics from saying that the resurrection account and appearances were developed and redacted into the narratives much later on, as this 2-year difference doesn't allow for that to take place. Any militant atheist out there listening to this is that you need to stop with the whole grand conspiracy angle. Dr. Gary Habermas is the go-to scholar on the resurrection debate, and he has many of his works online for free and highlights that Paul's 180-degree switch from murderer to missionary is one of the best apologetics at your disposal, because only a significant event like seeing the risen Lord can account for Paul's dramatic shift from persecutor to champion of the faith. So, indirectly, we are dealing with the authorship debate in all of this. Even under the critical view, Galatians is still considered authentic Pauline in the mid-50s. The Gospels are all after 70 AD because if the Synoptic Gospels, that includes Luke, were written before 70 AD, is that you then have a supernatural predictive prophecy problem on your hands, as Jesus predicted the temple being destroyed 40 years in advance. Another topic for another day. But when it comes to only dealing with Luke's historical accuracy, is that critical scholar and archaeologist William Ramsay admitted at the end of the day that Luke's rendering of history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. And this came after his original position is that the gospel was written in the late 2nd century AD and filled with a bunch of historical errors and mythical legends like, the virgin birth, miracles, and the resurrection. So, Ramsay informs us that Luke is spot on in his recorded history. He's a prime example of how one's opinion can and will change if they actually dig into the matter and don't form their opinion from a meme. One more passing point is that when you take in consideration the sabbatical years, is that even more of the gospel account comes to light. Because we can fill in the gaps between all of these and see that Jesus' ministry very likely launched on a sabbatical year, which is really smart to do as everyone is off from work and large crowds can gather together, follow you around, and listen to your preaching for days on end. Now, all of this transitions us to Luke's census in his nativity story. Here, there are typically 3 attacks on the account. First, Josephus didn't mention the census, therefore Luke can't be fully trusted. Next one cast doubt on whether or not an actual official census would really force Joseph and Mary to go to Bethlehem to register. And the big one with Luke mentioning that Cyrenius was governor of Syria at this time. But it needs to be acknowledged up front is that if you've been going off of a 4 BC date for Herod's death, then you have been looking at the wrong time period the entire time, and have to take a fresh look at the 3 and 2 BC dates. First off, Luke does recognize the more well-known census in 6 AD when Cyrenius took over for Archelaus that coincides with Judas the Galilean leading a small uprising. But does anything look peculiar on this timeline right now? 6-7 AD was a sabbatical year, which is a perfect time to conduct a census. Unlike, 2020 with never-ending survey calls. But this sheds some new light with the 2-1 BC sabbatic year in proximity of Jesus' birth. Now, because Herod died in 1 BC, is that the artificial governor of Syria gap that Schur and others create from 4 to 1 BC or to 180 goes away when it's recognized that Varus served as governor twice, as Josephus has him taking over for Saturninus, and had to stop a Jewish revolt that ensued after Herod's funeral and spring Passover. This war had messianic tones all over it. And Tertullian, who dated Christ's birth in 3-2 BC, said that the census was taken by Saturninus. And this statement doesn't undermine what Luke wrote, because guess what? Cyrenius was governor of Galatia at this time. Roman historian Tacitus wrote about all the great honors that Augustus bestowed upon Cyrenius, with Tiberius giving him a grand funeral in 21 AD. So, Cyrenius had already been governor of Crete and Cyrenaica before his time in Syria. He was named Roman consul in 12 BC, which I hope you understand is a pretty big, huge honor. Next, he led the campaign as governor in Turkey and served as legate in Galatia. Augustus also appointed him as tutor/trainer of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus's grandson, to train him up on political leadership because he was inexperienced, but was next in line to be the emperor. Gaius Caesar died in 3 AD, but in that year, Augustus named Cyrenius Duumviri as the joint magistrate of the whole empire with him. Then appointed Cyrenius governor of Syria from 6 to 12 AD, when Augustus had enough of Archelaus sucking and obviously he ended up conducting the local census and taxation after arriving. And on his death, Emperor Tiberius gave him a grand funeral in Rome. Needless to say, this is not some low-level chump here. This is Augustus's go-to man to get big tasks done. So, does a special appointment by Augustus in 32 BC to oversee a census really seem out of the possibility? Obviously not. And Ramsey's point remains true that Luke's history is rock solid. So there is no throwing baby Jesus out with the bathwater because of an argument from silence on Josephus's end. But where is the evidence of a census even taking place during this time, right? First, Josephus informs us that there were more than just one governor of Syria at this time. You have Titus named here helping calm the waters between Herod and Archelaus. Then also a man named Volumnius at the same time of Saturninus. And Josephus continued to speak of multiple governors of Syria ruling at the same time while Herod was still alive. Writing about the same time as Tacitus is Justin Martyr, who wrote his first apology, an apologetic work in some respects, and said that Jesus was born when Cyrenius became the first procurator of Judea and could be found in the Roman tax records of that time. The catch here is that Justin was writing directly to Emperor Pius and the entire Roman government, because he was more or less begging them to stop the persecution of Christians. So, he was telling them that the proof of his claims about Jesus was to go check their very own records. You don't do that unless it really occurred. The interesting thing about Justin calling Cyrenius a procurator instead of governor is that Tacitus, in his biography about his father-in-law's conquest of Great Britain, said that two men were set over the Brits. One was a lieutenant and the other was a procurator. The procurator's job was to handle governing the local properties, like with taxation and taking enrollments. But the neat thing is that Tacitus also called them governors. So, a procurator held the same authority as a governor of a Roman province. But still, where's the 32 BC census proof, right? How about right from Augustus himself? In his autobiography, he talked about how great he was. That included his conducting of 3 censuses in 28 BC, 8 BC, and 14 AD, where the people were registered, and that vows, or you could really say oaths, to him as emperor were to be made by the councils and priests every 5th year. 5th year from the 8 BC census is 3 BC. But look what he adds to this. Moreover, all the citizens, both individual and by their towns, of one accord repeatedly made supplication at all the gods' couches for my health. This matches exactly the description of what Luke said about Augustus' order in 2:1. Augustus also mentioned how he made Cyrenius consul in 12 BC, which was the same year that he was bestowed with the title of Pontifex Maximus. Then, in 2 BC, he instituted the Games of Mars that were played in the Circus Maximus, the Roman Forum, and the amphitheater, and finished building the Temple of Mars. So, you should be thinking Mardi Gras and the World Cup final on roids here. As he was explaining all of this, is that Augustus recounted the Battle of Actium, and that he had all the provinces swear an oath of allegiance to him. Whereupon, in 27 BC, he received the title Augustus from the Senate and the citizens. Recall that Augustus held a census prior to the Roman Senate honoring him with this divine-like title. The note here for us is the order in which this occurred, because the very last thing that he recounted is how in 2 BC he was given the new title Father of the Fatherland. and it was given to him by the whole Roman people. That includes the provinces. The official bestowing of this new title on him took place on February 5th, 2 BC, so the regular people's oath would have been done before this in 3 BC. 2 BC also marked the Silver Jubilee, or 25th year, of Augustus's rule as emperor, and was also the 750th anniversary of the founding of Rome. This provides us with the reasoning why Augustus was throwing the biggest festival Rome had ever had. But, where's the 3 BC whole Roman world oath mandate, right? That comes from two sources. The first is in Suetonius' famous work, The 12 Caesars. He reiterated that Augustus held 3 censuses in 28 BC, 8 BC, and 14 AD, and that Augustus required the people to give him the same veneration as to the gods, i.e., deified emperor worship. 258. The whole body of citizens, with a sudden unanimous impulse, proffered him the title Father of his country. So, the whole empire had to revere Augustus with this new title, and Suetonius adds that it first started with the commoners, which would have been conducted in 3 BC. This follows the same pattern that we saw in 28-27 BC with his new title as Augustus. In the book Roman Civilization by Lewis and Reinhold, is that they have the actual oath that each person had to give during the 3rd year from Augustus's 12th stint as consul, which was in 5 BC. That places the 3rd year from it in 3 BC. But where does it say that the Jews in Judea had to do this? That brings us to our second source, Josephus. He wrote, "Accordingly, when all the people of the Jews gave assurance of their goodwill to Caesar and to the king's government, these Pharisees did not swear, being above 6,000 of them." Notice that all the people were made to do this, but 6,000 Pharisees refused to do so because they were not going to bow down and honor the emperor this way as he demanded them to do so. So right there is your 3 BC whole world census that Luke was referring to. And instead of thinking of the normal IRS taxation process here, is that it is better to understand it as the people were being enrolled or registered as swearing allegiance to Augustus and worshiping him as the divine father of the fatherland. The Pharisees didn't take the oath because they were believed to have the foreknowledge of things to come by divine inspiration. They foretold how God had decreed that Herod's government should cease and his posterity should be deprived of it. If you're not hearing Daniel 2, 7, and 9 in this, then please go check out that series. But these predictions were not concealed from Salome, but were told to Herod. This is an absolute death blow to the 4 BC date, as Herod is still alive after the empire-wide oath mandate was given to them in 3-2 BC. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justcripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.